We're on to the book of Deuteronomy today, which is a very difficult word to spell, and we're going to do chapters 1 to 7. The word Deuteronomy, in terms of what it means, I gather it derives from Greek, and it appears to mean something along the lines of repetition. So it seems like it's a summary of all that's happened in the last 40 years throughout the Exodus, as in through the book of Exodus, Leviticus and Numbers. Initially, admittedly, this was a little bit disappointing, and looking at heart sink and like, oh no, we're going to have to repeat all this stuff again. But some really interesting stuff. I haven't read the whole thing yet, but certainly these chapters 1 to 7 largely were in the form of a massive speech from Moses. The guy's going for it. He's clearly nearing his end, and he's doing some sort of wrapping up summary for a bunch of the Israelites, and just doing the mother and father of all speeches, just basically telling the story. And I guess in that, making sure everybody's clear on what's happened, why it's happened, what they're supposed to be doing, and what's going to happen next. There was a slightly amusing part where he refers to the number of Israelites as the same number of Israelites as the number of stars in the sky. A quick check with the Google reveals that, obviously no one knows how many stars there, but an estimate I've seen is 200 sextillion stars. To put that in context, that's 2 with 23 zeros after it. So there are definitely not that many Israelites. I think potentially it could look like there's an issue there, because that originally came from God. Understandably, Moses doesn't know how many stars are. I look up in the sky and it's like, well, there's quite a lot, but there's not 200 sextillion of them. But God should have known that, and God is the one who originally said, I think it was Abraham, wasn't it? I'm going to make your descendants more numerous than the stars in the sky. And so it begs the question, does God not know how many stars there are? In which case, he should, surely, because if he made them, then he would know. But I think it does seem metaphorical, and it's also valid that communication happens on the listener's terms, so that metaphor might make sense spoken to people of that time, because you look up in the sky and think, well, there's quite a few, but there's certainly not bajillions of them. So it would make sense to Moses, and we do know that God is quite happy talking in metaphors quite a lot of the time, so I don't think that's a massive blunder we've stumbled across. I think it just does seem to be the way everyone talks at that point. There's a bit that's rather cheeky, I thought, where Moses describes to the Israelites how it implies it's their fault that he's not entering the promised land. And he's saying, because of you, I'm not doing this. But that's not true at all, is it? Because if you recall, what happened was God said to Moses, go and talk to this rock to make the water come out. And Moses completely ignored that, went up and whacked it with his stick, and the water came out. And at that point, God said, reflect a lack of trust. You didn't do what I told you, therefore you're not going in. Clearly not the Israelites' fault. So that was interesting, especially given the idea that we're assuming still that Moses wrote. I think this is the last book that Moses wrote, or is generally regarded as the last book that Moses wrote. So if he wrote it, he knows perfectly well what happened earlier, and he's saying something later that conflicts with what he said. So I don't know what to do with that, really. But it's not massive, it's not particularly significant, but vaguely interesting anyway. There are a few tribes that God names that need to be left alone, which I thought was interesting, because I didn't pick out from the book of Numbers that there were okay people. It always just seemed to be listing people who were terrible and they need to be wiped out. So the fact that there are some tribes who are deemed to be perfectly fine, that obviously clarifies that not everyone is terrible, which then implies that the people who are, the societies that are being wiped out, are being chosen specifically for what they are doing, which I guess lends credence to the weight of all this rubbish that Baal gets up to. Well, not Baal himself, people in the name of Baal get up to. So that's kind of useful context, which perhaps it was in Numbers, but I definitely missed if it was there. Moses seems to get cheeky and say to God, are you kind of sure I can't see the promised land? I quite like to see it now, we're so close. But God is adamant. He's like, no, you are not entering it. Go up this mountain and look north, east, south, west, and you'll be able to see it at least. But that's God's final word on it. That's clearly a very solid consequence. It does beg the question whether the punishment fits the crime. But then, to be fair, at this point, I think Moses he's deep into 6 figures in terms of age now, I think. So it's time for him to die anyway. So perhaps, it doesn't really matter. But going back to a point in the previous video about God is occasionally persuadable. It seems he's persuadable on matters of sort of policy, as it were, but not in terms of if there's a consequence that has to be delivered for something, that has to be done. That's there's no flexibility around that. So that's an interesting idea, I think, that one. Very exciting, and we get a bit of clarification about what the glory of God looks like. If you recall, I was a little grumbly about twice the glory of God appears and no one bothers to write down what that looks like. But Moses clarifies now that it's formless, so sounds like it is just a ball of fire. And he further states that the reason it's formless is because then no one can make anything, no image to represent what God looks like, i.e. no idol. And as an interesting thing there, isn't it, I think, in that God is clearly very keen on this anti-idolatry thing, even if it's an idol that represents him. So that would seem to suggest that God is far more interested in spiritual connection with God than he is in any sort of physical world representation of him. So that's very interesting, that one. And I assume that sort of grates on the idea of Christianity later on, because there's a lot of physical representations of it all and art and all the rest of it. So I guess we'll have to see how that one pans out. There's a straight up statement that the miracles that all the Israelites have seen are to prove that God exists. You're like, great, fine, that's kind of what we gathered from the whole Exodus thing with the plagues, that's what I mean. But you then, okay, well, what about the last 2,000 years when there's been nothing? I suppose there's an argument in that at that point they didn't have any Bible to look to for any sort of evidence. Evidence might be a strong word. Any sort of account of things that have gone before. Whereas now we do have that. That 2,000 year separation, I think, is one of my key hurdles, I think, to accepting all this stuff. There's something difficult about, there was amazing stuff happened thousands of years ago, now nothing happens at all. And maybe some things do, but you certainly don't hear things in the news that some miraculous thing as water started randomly coming from a rock. But I don't think it's necessarily unreasonable because there is historical evidence for a lot of this stuff, which we'll look at some point. But that wouldn't have been the case for the Israelites back in that day. There was just nothing for them to look back to, presumably. So yeah, that's an interesting idea. I'm not quite sure what to do with it. But again, another one we'll keep an eye on as we go through. And hopefully we're going to get wiser as we get through this. We again have the point being made that punishment for sins is going to be visited 4 generations down, which conflicts with what happened in terms of the grumbling Israelites, and God saying the grumblers who saw the plagues of Egypt won't then be allowed into the promised land, but their children will. So God has basically waived his own consequence, but it seems in other places that the consequences can't be waived. It's important that they are delivered. So I don't know if I've just missed something there as well. It's the trouble with these summaries, isn't it? It pulls out all these ideas and it's like, it's not quite what I thought it was, but I think the big picture we're gathering anyway. So, but yeah, some of the detail is quite tricky, and I guess I've not gone into massive detail either, quite deliberately. So I'm sure we could pull this stuff apart and really dig into it. But that's for someone else to do. For these purposes, we're just interested in the big ideas and the grand scale sort of thing. There's 7 nations listed as being larger and stronger than the Israelites, which is not how I understood that. I thought the idea was that the Israelites went into Egypt as a sort of incubation to make them massive, then they come back out, and then they were bigger than all the other tribes. But no, turns out that's just not true. Not that particularly matters, I don't think, but it was interesting to clear that up, so it's not quite as I understood it. The 12-year-old boy in me was delighted in a sort of carry-on film style that there was a reference to a society called the Girgashites. That's a good name. And then we have a bit more pleasant talk about God loving the Israelites, which is... Well, there's not been a huge amount of that. It has been a lot of doom and gloom and do this, I am the Lord, do that, I am the Lord. So when the fluffy, softer stuff comes out, it does sort of stand out rather, but it is there clearly. And as I've said previously, it does also seem that on the harsher side, there's a reason why a lot of that's all happening. So that's further weight to the argument that the God of the Old Testament is not the terrible, mean, old, horrible thing that a lot of people might suggest he is. And finally, we have another restating that the reason all these societies that have been wiped out is because of all their pagan gods and what they've been getting up to. And that, combined with the societies that have been completely left alone, does suggest, I think, that there is a very clear segregation. If you're behaving yourself, you're okay. If you're chopping up children and burning them alive, you're not okay. But yeah, so that's 1-7 of Deuteronomy. I don't think it's going to take us very long to get through this, although there are a lot of interesting ideas. There's a great bit about testing coming up in the next bit, so we'll look at that next time. But on we go.